Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-641 requires that in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples in Canada, the government take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The Declaration is an expression of the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples and sets out principles of partnership and mutual respect that should guide the relationships between states and Indigenous peoples. I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the tireless efforts of Indigenous leaders from Canada, such as Chief Wilton Littlechild, Grand Chief Edward John, and so many others without whom this groundbreaking document would never have been realized. In fact, the principles laid out in the Declaration are similar to Canada's existing legal duties to meaningfully consult and, where necessary, accommodate Aboriginal communities before adopting or implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect their inherent and or treaty rights. In fact, it codifies what Indigenous peoples across the country know is necessary, expressed as nothing about us without us.
We must recognize the immense work that remains to be done and meet the needs of Canada's Indigenous peoples and to respect their treaty rights. They must be fulfilled and they must be practically applied.
Power. This government has pursued a paternalistic and non-consultative approach with Indigenous peoples in Canada, going so far as classifying them as adversaries in terms of resource development. The education gap is widening in terms of both funding and outcomes. Housing shortages are becoming more acute, water and wastewater systems are in crisis, and tragic gaps in First Nations health outcomes are continuing unabated. The clear frustration of Aboriginal peoples is understandable, given the litany of broken promises, complete lack of progress on issues of vital importance to them, and the refusal of the government to fulfill its legal obligation to consult on matters that may impact their inherent and or treaty rights. Le gouvernement fédéral a
We can see that we have the responsibility to restore relationships with our Indigenous people and the Métis people of Canada. And this is...
and has long expressed support for these principles, and as the parliamentary secretary noted, passed this support of UNDRIP at our Liberal Policy Convention in 2014. We continue also to urge the government to move forward with its implementation. We think the implementation requires federal leadership across all government departments and across all jurisdictions. It means that all levels of government must understand the principles in this declaration that Canada signed on to. The Liberal caucus will therefore be supporting this bill. The declaration establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, well-being and rights of the world's Indigenous peoples. It addresses both individual and collective rights, cultural rights, identity, right to education, health, employment, language, and others. The declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly on September the 13th, 2007, with an overwhelming majority. 143 states voted in favour and only 4 voted against, with 11 abstaining. Unfortunately, Canada was one of the 4 countries that initially rejected the declaration.
When we look at other international files, we've had seen a conservative government here with an obstructionist attitude, and this tarnishes Canada's reputation yet again on the world scene.
All 4 states which initially rejected the declaration have endorsed it. Australia endorsed the declaration in 2009, the U.S. indicated its endorsement in 2010, and New Zealand joined with its endorsement in the same year. In 2010, Canada also seemingly joined the international consensus by issuing a statement of support for its principles. Unfortunately, the Conservative government has done nothing since that statement to implement the principles in the declaration, and as you heard from the parliamentary secretary, doesn't even believe most of what it signed. It has consistently used the excuse that is merely aspirational in nature, and certainly in an order paper question that I tabled in this House, the response from the government was very clear. They asked what they were doing to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The answer was pretty well nothing. Nothing because it's aspirational, nothing across government departments, nothing in terms of dealing with the provinces and the territories and municipalities, as all levels of government must understand and honor this international declaration. While it's true that UN declarations are generally not legally binding, they do represent the evolution of international legal norms and reflect the commitment of states to make progress towards specific shared goals while abiding by certain principles. Further, as noted by the Native Law Centre of the University of Saskatchewan, the Declaration did not create new rights for Indigenous peoples, but expanded upon existing human rights law and clarifies how those general human rights protections apply to Indigenous peoples. Even if this government sees this document as merely aspirational, it's time for it to move forward with tangible actions to support achieving those aspirations, and I am particularly disappointed to hear from the parliamentary secretary that the government will not be supporting this private member's bill. Just last year, the current government rejected the UN Indigenous Peoples World Conference outcome document because of its call to implement the declaration. The 2014 UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples brought together over 1,000 Indigenous and non-Indigenous delegates to discuss the realization of Indigenous rights. The outcome document calls on member states to take, quote, appropriate measures at the national level, including legislative, policy, and administrative measures to achieve the ends of the UN declarations of the rights of Indigenous people. The outcome document also affirms provisions in the UN Declaration that decisions potentially affecting the rights of Indigenous peoples should be undertaken only with their free, prior, and informed consent. This seems to be the issue that this government takes issue with. It is so disappointing that they did not understand that the declaration really insists on people moving forward on that. If it's aspirational, it means you still have to move forward and make some action that actually demonstrates that you understand what you signed. The Conservative government refused to send even a minister to the UN World Conference on Indigenous People and then rejected the outcome document. This government seems to take particular issue with the principle that decisions potentially affecting the rights of Indigenous people should only be undertaken with their free, prior, and informed consent. For, as the parliamentary secretary said, Article 19 states that countries shall consult and cooperate in good faith with concerned Indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Article 32.2 states that countries shall consult and cooperate in good faith with concerned Indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with their development. The practical implications of this concept of free, prior, and informed consent are not dissimilar to the legal duties already imposed on governments by the treaties and now enshrined in our Constitution. My message to Canadians is that true reconciliation can only be achieved if we understand the history and the culture and the rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. That it is a process which we call idle Know-more, spelled K-N-O-W. It's something that colleagues here need to be part of in terms of how we can go forward. with, as my colleague from Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik AU, has said, in order to achieve true reconciliation. I hope and I encourage all of us to, here in this House, to take special time with the user's guide and parliamentary handbook that's been developed on DRIP, and I hope that we will move forward together in spite of the present government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.